Welcome to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast, brought to you by DonorSearch, the show that takes you inside the lives of thought leaders, innovators, and changemakers in fundraising, philanthropy, and civil society. I'm your host, Jay Frost. In today's episode, I speak with Helen Brown, founder and president of the Helen Brown Group, the world's largest and most influential development, research, consulting, and training agency. A fundraising professional since 1987, she served in leadership roles at several major institutions before launching her firm in 2005. Since that time, she and her team have worked with over 1,000 nonprofits around the world. Along the way, she served as president of NEDRA, which honored her with the Ann Castle Award, on the board of Apra, which recognized her with a Distinguished Service Award, and co-authored the definitive book in the field, Prospect Research for Fundraisers. I caught up with Helen at her home in Massachusetts.
I am great. Thank you for having me.
Where are you right now?
I am in Brewster, Massachusetts. Lovely Cape Cod. I am in a converted barn. It actually literally used to be a barn. There were horses in this barn. And when the pandemic happened, we moved permanently here from Watertown to Brewster. And I moved my office out into the barn, and it's the largest office that I've ever had. It's the whole second floor of a barn.
That must be kind of a special place to work. Did you always like that kind of setting?
I have always liked unusual places. I've always liked architecturally interesting places. And this is architecturally interesting. And interestingly, after it was a barn, the house was owned by a pair of artists, potters. And so downstairs in the barn was where they had their kilns. And then upstairs here where I am used to be their shop, the place where they used to display all of their stuff. So I suppose I'm in a barn and converted pottery shop.
But there must be a lot of history there if it was actually a barn for animals at one point before it was a potter studio and now the center of your work. What's the origin of the farm? How long has it been there?
Well, actually, here on Cape Cod, it seems like there were very, very small kind of homesteady sorts of farms, but this place was, I believe, literally just a place where originally people had just horses in this barn for, I don't even know what purpose. I suppose I should do some research, shouldn't I, to find out why they had horses. But the property is such that this property couldn't be a farm because the topography wouldn't lend itself. It's really steep and goes down to a pond. So I'm not sure why they had horses here.
How did you find that place?
We were just taking a short weekend trip here, staying with a friend who had a place that she rented, and she gave it to us as a present for some work. And this place was across the street from that with a for sale sign. And we'd never really thought about owning on Cape Cod before, but we had such a magical time that weekend. It was wintertime. It was cold. It was, the beach was just sparkling and amazing. And so we saw this for sale sign across the street, and I was like, well, let's just check it out. Let's look on Zillow. And it needed help. I mean, the house was, boy, did it need help, which made it affordable. So it was just as serendipitous as that.
And you're tied to that place now, that's clear, but you're not from around there originally. Where are you from?
I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and then we moved to Washington, D.C. when I was small. Then when I was about 6, we moved back to Pennsylvania. And then when I was 10, we moved to North Carolina. And then I was there until I was 24 and then moved up here to Boston. So I'm kind of north, south, north kind of person.
Sure. Well, that explains the Chapel Hill connection, I guess, because you went to school there at UNC. Was that just, how did that come about?
Well, it's interesting because I got accepted to a few colleges. One of them was BU, Boston University, and the other one was UNC Chapel Hill. And I really wanted to go to Boston. Like, I knew as a kid that I wanted to live in Boston. I don't know why. Maybe, reading Johnny Tremain. I don't know, like all of those books that you read when you're in school. But anyway, I loved Boston. So I really wanted to go to BU really, really badly. But the in-state tuition for UNC Chapel Hill was too good to pass up. So I ended up going to UNC Chapel Hill instead, which ended up being the very best decision that I could have made ever. Because for my junior year for my junior year, I decided that I wanted to go abroad. And I ended up going to Manchester, the University of Manchester, which basically transformed my life. So if I hadn't gone to Chapel Hill, I wouldn't have gone to Manchester. And if I hadn't gone to Manchester, I probably wouldn't be who or where I am now.
How was that transformative?
I was a kid from North Carolina. I'd never I'd traveled, like once before on my own with a school trip. Well, I can't say I was on my own with a school trip to Washington, D.C., but I'd never really been anywhere myself. So, I got on a plane going internationally with 5 suitcases and had to make my way on my own in a foreign country, in a place I didn't know at all, amongst flatmates that I had never met before. And it was really transformative in terms of me understanding how much I could rely on myself and be independent and, just be able to do it. Just say, yeah, I can do that. Make decisions and see them through.
Do you remember arriving there and what it was like your first time?
Arriving in England for the first time?
Yes, in Manchester. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I felt like I had come home. It felt very, I was an English major. And again, maybe just reading all of the books that I read growing up, I was always interested in English lit. And so it felt very comfortable to me being in England. But, just stuff like dealing with 5 suitcases on the tube and, just silly things like, realizing that I just had way too much. Like I literally did not need that much baggage. Right. And I think that was both a literal and metaphor for, you just don't need all that much baggage in life. And you can just leave it behind. So, but yeah, it felt very comfortable.
Was coming back a shock after being there in that environment?
Yeah, it was. And I was one of those boring people who was like, well, when I was in England last year, I'm sure that my friends were just like, oh my God, will she please stop talking about her junior year abroad? But I had a friend who was in France at the same time. She was at UNC. She was one of my roommates and she was in France when I was in England. So we were able to travel together and stuff. So I wasn't alone in when I was abroad last year, she could do it too. But yeah, it was a bit of a shock coming back to North Carolina after being in such a, I mean, Manchester back then was still very much, I mean, it wasn't London, it was the Northwest. It was all the things I suppose that it is now, just more so. It wasn't worldly, but I felt like it was. I felt like it was just an incredibly worldly place. And, traveling around from Manchester, I mean, London, you could be in London in 3 hours. I could be in Paris in 5 hours. I mean, it was astonishing to me how close things were and how easy it was to get around on buses and trains and whatnot. And, I continue this day, my absolute adoration for train travel, just being able to look out the window and see the countryside go by and be somewhere else, but be able to, I don't know, watch the world go by while you're getting there. I don't know if that makes sense, but yeah.
Sure. But then you come back, you finish your degree, but you stay. That was your first role, wasn't it? Was there at UNC?
It was. Well, yes, it was my first role in development. After I graduated from college, like everybody else, I wasn't sure how to get a foothold or what my career was going to be. And so I actually worked for a catering company for a couple of years. And it sort of, things kind of came to a head where I just realized this wasn't what I wanted to do with my life. And so I quit and went and signed up with a temp agency. And my first and last temp job was as the receptionist at the development office at UNC Chapel Hill. And I had been sitting at the reception desk for about 3 hours when the director of research came out and said, "Hi, you want to work on a research project?" I was like, "Sure, I'll do anything." And I was like, "Tell me more about this research job." And she said, "Well, these are the sorts of things that we do." And that was it. That was it. I was hooked, lined, and sinkered. It was it. I mean, it combined my love of philanthropy, research. It was everything. Still is. I mean, it's the best profession in the world.
It's amazing how they just came right out to you and say, "We want to get involved in this research project." I'm thinking about all the things that were great about that, but all the frightening aspects of it too. Do you remember what they were asking you to do?
Oh, I think it probably was like looking up something in the database and
right.
Figuring out who was coming to an event or something. It was probably events driven at that point. Yeah.
Sure. Well, and the resources then were not as they are today.
No, we had Who's Who, Dun and Bradstreet. You had to call away to get annual reports and proxy statements. Yeah, I mean, it was pretty much Who's Who and D&B.
Right. That's the real work of research, right? I mean, needing to figure it out, tie it together, make sure it's right. Was there a lot of that going on there? Do you remember the size of the shop?
Oh, sure. Yeah, because it took me a year and a half to kind of, you couldn't move directly from, so I got the job. I applied and got the job as the receptionist, and then you had to move up. So I had to be like, I was a secretary 3 on the front desk. I had to move up to a secretary 4. So I had to have another position before I could move up to be a researcher. So it took me like 2 secretary jobs in order to be even able to apply for the research job. And then I was the 3rd researcher in the department, and we had a director of research. So I was trained by Janice and Karen, who did an awesome job. And my director of research, who was Bunny Kalura, who took a chance on me and was a wonderful teacher and boss. Yeah.
It's a great thing about part of this field is that people remember and name check, honor the people who have been important to them along the way. And
we're all self-taught, right? I mean,
right.
We're all for prospect research, I mean, kind of back in the day, at that point, there wasn't an Apra. I mean, Apra was literally just starting. So there were these nascent groups, Apra and NEDRA, of people who were doing prospect research who were just like, we should get together and talk about this because we don't know what we're doing. And so we need to teach each other about what we're doing. So at that point, your mentors were everything because, it really depended on how good your mentors were, whether or not you were a good researcher. I mean, obviously, you bring something to the table as well, your own self-motivation and determination and interest and all of that sort of stuff. But, you don't know what you don't know. And so your mentors are incredibly important. And I think that's still true today, obviously, but we do have a lot more resources out there to teach us about our craft.
Right. I'm even thinking about how people communicate with one another. And you just mentioned Apra and NEDRA, and they were both, if they existed at all, they were really nascent. And I don't know that there was a mechanism they had to communicate with one another yet. The first Apra conference, I think that was 88. And then, so it's, and that was a largely informal gathering. But that was around the time then, I guess, that you also moved to Boston, where you said you always wanted to live. How did that come about that you moved back to New England?
So UNC sent me to a case conference on prospect research. It was probably one of the first prospect research conferences, Anyway, it was case conference. It was in Baltimore. I was psyched because I'd never been to Baltimore before. And never been to a conference before. And I was in Baltimore, and, it was the big city, and I had Indian food in England and thought it was just the best thing. And I'd happened to look up and saw that there was an Indian restaurant in Baltimore. And so I was like, well, I don't want to go by myself. So I stuck up a note on the bulletin board saying, hey, I want to go for Indian food. Anybody want to go? And like 5 people signed up. And so we ended up going to this Indian restaurant, and this gentleman sat next to me, and he said, I just wanted to talk to this person who's, very clearly a young person who just said, hey, let's go out for Indian food. And I talked to him for a while, and he ended up being the executive director of a nonprofit in Boston. And about 3 months later, he called me up and said, we're going to have a prospect research position, and we'd love for you to apply. So I essentially got recruited because of Indian food and going to England. If I hadn't gone to England, I wouldn't have had Indian food. If I hadn't had Indian food, I wouldn't have put a sign up. And that's what got me to Boston.
It says a lot about raising your hand too. And you were willing to do that, to just reach out to people you didn't know. That's something we've talked about in this field, in the subset of the field of research and prospect development for a long time, about how there are some people who are willing to do these things, these small gestures that enable them to build networks and help other people. But some people are more reticent. Do you have any thoughts about that, about how you were able to do that and why it's still so challenging for so many?
Oh, it's still challenging for me. I mean, I'm the classic introvert, right? I mean, it's hard for anybody in our field. Well, I can't say anybody, but it is notoriously difficult for people who are introverts to raise their hand like that and to sort of step out of the comfort zone. But what I have found personally is that the best things that have happened in my career and in my life have been when I've walked towards things that have scared me, when I've done things that are outside of my comfort zone. And, good things tend to happen, when you're able to just walk towards those things that scare you.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, you were in Boston and the area for quite a while. You were at Albert Einstein, Boston College, and then you were at the Harvard School of Public Health. I don't mean to just jettison past all these great places, but I have to ask you about something which is also kind of putting yourself forward. So I remember distinctly getting a copy, the paper copy of the Chronicle Philanthropy, and there you were on the front cover.
Yeah.
And that must be a decision you made to put yourself out there and to be covered in that public way when you tend to focus on your work and other people, and you're not self-adulatory. And there you were being celebrated by the Chronicle. How did that come about, and how did you decide to let them feature you in that way?
I have no idea why I said yes to that. I think back now. I mean, Holly Hall was the person who wrote that article. I don't even know how Holly got my name, although I have some suspicions. Not going to name any names, but I think that, they were doing an article about, I don't even know what it was, like the advent or the rise of, or the number of gay and lesbian fundraisers. And I think that they couldn't find a woman frontline fundraiser to say yes to being featured in this article. And somehow Holly got my name and asked me if I would be willing to be interviewed for the article. And I figured probably, nobody knows who I am anyway. I'm just a prospect researcher. So it's not like anybody's going to, see me or know who I am or anything. So, sure, I'll do an interview. And so I did the interview. And then I think after that, she was like, okay, so we're going to have a photographer come and, be there on this. And I was like, wait, what? I'm sorry, what? So it was sort of like in for a penny, in for a pound at that point. It was like, well, still nobody knows who I am. So, just a prospect researcher. What do I care? Whatever. Mm-hmm. And then I got on the front cover or something. And it was just like, okay, did not expect that. But, I'm kind of making light of it. But, this was a time when, this was pre everything, pre-gay marriage, even people really being out at work. And, of course, I talked to my supervisor at School of Public Health, and they were all basically like, yeah, okay, it's not a problem, Helen. You're not going to hear anything from us saying that you shouldn't do it. It's like, okay, well, all right, well, I guess I don't have to worry about my job. So, I mean, it was not a usual decision for me, who likes to kind of in terms of my personal life, put my head above the parapet. Mm-hmm. But I also felt in a way that if I didn't do it, and Holly was telling me that, nobody else was willing to stand up, I thought, well, maybe if I stand up, other people will be less uncomfortable about standing up, because again, there's nothing unusual or I don't mean to say not special about me, but I'm just an average normal person who just happens to be gay. So anybody else could say, could feel comfortable, maybe more comfortable after I stood up.
This is a conversation that, having it today, it's something that is talked about by lots of people. But then it was, as you're saying, less so. And so it must have been something for you to make that decision, that commitment to allow for that discussion to be held and for other people to see that example. But then, you went home among friends and talked to them and stuff. And I'm sure that some of your work then, it wasn't just about you at that point either. It was also putting a face to prospect research. So I'm imagining you're explaining a couple things to people. First of all, something that maybe now they know you a little bit better, which is great. Also something about the institution, because it sounds like they were at least not obstructionist, but in fact, if anything, supporting you in every way.
Yeah, they really were. Yeah.
Which says a lot about the time. But then it also means that there was a focus on prospect research, which I have to say that that may not have been a controversial field at the time, but it certainly wasn't particularly well known. Is that a fair thing to say?
Yeah, I hadn't really thought until just now about how that really put a name to prospect research. Sort of, I just kind of thought of myself as amongst friends, we sort of joke that I was the gay poster child for fundraising, but I hadn't really thought about it being the gay prospect research poster child. So yeah, I guess I had put a name to prospect research. Wow. Okay. Hadn't put that together.
Well, it really was a different era in a lot of different ways. I mean, I'm trying to remember exactly when that happened. What year was that you were in the Chronicle?
It was in the early 90s. So
right.
I want to say maybe, I don't remember, like 93, 94, 95, something like that.
Right. And that was also a period where not only were, people having a lot of discussions that they weren't open about before, but they were also talking about development in new ways. Again, that's what I was kind of alluding to. And maybe part of that was because on the prospect research side of that discussion, because of the advent of technologies that didn't exist before. So if you were using Who's Who down at UNC Chapel Hill and maybe a few CD-ROMs, you were now, it's full-blown internet, everybody's doing everything. And there were screening services that existed using all sorts of different stuff, from modeling to hard data and lots of other things. Even I think for a while there, some of the institutions were utilizing Social Security numbers in order to do matches, which of course we wouldn't do anymore. That was all pre-HIPAA. So it's a very different sort of time. What was it like for you working, especially at the School of Public Health, working in research, now having more visibility, both personally but also professionally, and then seeing this kind of big wave of change in the field?
Well, it's interesting because, personally, professionally, there were a lot more resources. But, at this time, I mean, even then, Jay, the internet was happening, but I mean, we were still using modems. It was you would plug in, you wouldn't even plug in a URL. I can't even remember what we used to, there were trees of you'd plug in what wasn't even a URL at that time. And then I literally would walk away from my desk. I'd go make a cup of tea and I would come back and the page would have loaded. I mean, people now just don't how did we even work like that? And I remember I hired somebody to work with me in the research department at the School of Public Health. And she was all into this new internet thing. And it was just this was the big thing. And it's I knew that it was going to be the big thing, but it wasn't yet. And she was, I don't know, there was something that she was looking up and waiting for the page to load. And I literally walked over to the director of corporate affiliations, opened up the book and handed it to her and was like, this is what you're looking for. It was so much easier and quicker to just still use some of those old resources. But yeah, the advent of, CD-ROMs like BoardLink,
right,
was a big one. BoardLink was great. So yes, I mean, that was really terrific. And then, I remember thinking not too long ago that we were really, the sort of mid to late 2000s really kind of started the golden age of prospect research, where the advent of services that were available and our ability to access them became so much easier. just, I think about the time pre-Google and then post-Google, or any search engine, really. I mean, Netscape, for crying out loud, was just, a thing of beauty. And so having, the wealth screening, I mean, Jay, you remember the wealth screenings, like you used to get books upon books about like binders and binders and binders of information that you'd have to like go through. You certainly, as a prospect researcher at that point, working for a large shop, you didn't have to worry about job security because all of these huge binders would show up and somebody had to go through them. So that was great, but just the services that got better and better and better. And then, of course, Apra and NEDRA, I mean, particularly people like Ann Castle, who transformed the way that I think people thought about prospect research, because not only was she a prospect researcher, but she was also director of research at Harvard, which really, I think, carried some weight amongst people who might have been prospect research skeptics. And then she got involved with the Slate 60. And then she got involved with the White House Conference on Philanthropy. And all of a sudden, it was sort of like, prospect researchers have some cred here. I mean, we really have something to say. And I think that was, in a way, kind of gave some of us a bit of a, hey, you know what? Like we've got it going on here. We could actually not just be kind of back office secretary type providing information people, but we could actually work in partnership with frontline fundraisers and really like transform stuff here. And then when Anne passed away, I remember my friend Valerie Anastasio called me up and we were sort of talking about it. Valerie was working at Harvard at the time, and she said, you know what this means? This means that those of us who are left behind really have to step up now. And we really have to fill those shoes that Anne has left. And I have never forgotten that, because I really have felt like we do have a responsibility to kind of show what the capabilities are for prospect research and for utilizing all the great tools that are out there for us to use and really make a difference.
I have a couple of questions in there. And one is for people who listen to this and still don't really know what it is that prospect research, prospect development is all about. If you were telling people what the value of it is in terms of not just raising money, although that's important, but also institutional life, pursuit of mission, why is this work important? What does it do?
Well, I think from a very basic perspective, if nothing else, prospect research helps organizations be more efficient and save time, because you can always look at any roster of donors and start at A and go to Z, and eventually you will find your best prospects there. But the kind of work that prospect researchers, prospect development professionals do is allow organizations to hone in on those donor prospects with the most interest and the most capacity and the closest link to an organization more quickly than they could without it. And perhaps most importantly is to find that thing that piques a donor's interest in that particular cause. And, the other thing is that I understand that there are frontline fundraisers who say, well, yeah, but I can find that in a meeting in, 20 seconds, what somebody's interested in. And yes, that is true. But you might talk to 45 people before you get to that one person who's the best person. And we can help put you in front of that best person much more quickly. And also, there are things that prospect researchers, prospect development professionals can find that a frontline fundraiser would never be able to bring up sitting in front of a donor, and vice versa. There are things that frontline fundraisers can find in that conversation that we would never know about. But the partnership of those two professions can radically transform much more efficiently an organization's ability to raise money, I believe.
So when you think about all this, and then you think back to where you were as you worked through these institutions and became increasingly involved in NEDRA, and then I guess roughly the same time Apra, and became the president of one, and then joined the board of the other. You then founded your own firm. So how much of the thinking in deciding to do that was kind of a natural outgrowth of where you were professionally, but also seeing the opportunity and maybe feeling the obligation you talked about that Anne represented in taking this work to a kind of a different level?
Yeah, well, for me, I had been kind of thinking about consulting for a while, and had done a couple of consulting gigs on the side, mainly for UK universities that were wanting to set up 501c3s in the United States, to a support foundation in the United States to really engage with their alumni. And so I had done a little bit of work helping identify board members and prospects and that sort of thing. And had kind of, thought, well, I would really like to do consulting. I would like to work with a wide variety of organizations, but I didn't really kind of know how to take that first step, or I don't know. I was very comfortable in the jobs that I was in and felt supported and all of that sort of stuff. And then September 11th happened. And it was a real moment for me to say to myself, okay, what do you want to do here? What do you want to do with your life? What do you want to do professionally? So it was kind of one of those fish or cut bait moments. And that was the moment that I decided that, I think that there's an opportunity here to help provide the kind of, professional level prospect research, prospect development, but at that point it was just called prospect research, to nonprofits that maybe couldn't afford to have an in-house prospect researcher, or didn't want to deal with the overhead, or whatever. They just wanted to hire somebody who knew what they were doing, and be able to help take them to the next level without having to go through the growing pains of that. And so that's really kind of how I started the company. But I always knew that I didn't want to be a one-person shop. I knew that I worked better as in a team, and I knew that I wanted to have a team around me. And so very purposefully eventually got to the point where with help of some good friends who sat around a dinner table one night, yourself included, who said, we think that you should consider the name of the company to be the Helen Brown Group. Putting my name on it was something that was difficult for me, because I wanted to, I don't know, it's still that kind of not wanting to sort of, it's that introvert part of me. But group was a very important part of the name. I wanted it to be the Helen Brown Group from the very beginning, even when in the very beginning it was just me.
It's been a while now since you founded the firm. So that was that 2005 when you went public, I guess?
Yep.
Until today. So we've got, wow, that's a good number of years. What has that been like for you over that time? I know you've grown considerably as a firm, but in terms of what you imagined it would be versus what it has blossomed to be?
It's really kind of outpaced my wildest dreams. I remember having a conversation with some folks early on, and I was like, I'm going to get up to 10 employees someday. And both they and I were like, wow, can you imagine a prospect research company that's 10 employees? And now we're almost 30. It's kind of astonishing to me. But, I suppose it's like anything else. I mean, you build something, you value the people who are working with you, and you do the very best that you can to give the best quality product that you can to your clients, your customers, and you treat them well. And it just kind of happens, I guess.
Yeah.
And it's hard work, I mean, there's hard work along the way. Of course, I don't mean to say, oh, it just fell in my lap. It was great. But
and you're providing services of different types now as well. I know you've expanded the portfolio, but one of those is I know you have a connection to Definitive. Can you talk about that a bit?
Sure. Yeah. Definitive is a service that we started. It actually kind of started about the pandemic. It seems to be a theme of world-shaking events. About 2020, I noticed that my team was doing a lot more research on people who had donor-advised funds, and we were sort of talking about, we kind of need to gather these donor-advised funds in one place because, we need to have that kind of information just available. And so we started a spreadsheet, and it kind of grew pretty quickly. And then, we started getting 10,000 records and then 20,000 records. And it was sort of like, whoa, this is bigger than just something that HBG needs to have. We need to make this a service for prospect development professionals. Like, keeping it seemed like hoarding. And so, of course, then we had to make it look pretty, and we created a website around it. And so now Definitive, it's the only lookup service that's available, as far as I know, for donor-advised fund information. And people are using it as a prospecting tool. So, my team uses it as prospecting for interests or geographical area, or, looking up names of people who have donor advised funds. And it's expanded. We've included a blog. We've also included resource lists that, people can get more information from places like the DAF Research Collaborative or National Philanthropic Trust, Giving USA, places that are tracking information about donor advised funds. But, these donor advised funds are just exploding. Just the number of donor advised funds. There's over 1 million DAFs today. In 2005, there were like, 260,000 DAFs in 2015. So from 2015 to 2020, they grew from 260,000 to 1 million today. It's astonishing to me. So we decided that somebody needed to track them, and I looked around and nobody else was doing it. So I thought, well, I guess it's me.
Well, there's always room for more data, but especially when it's a service that focuses in on the biggest area of growth and giving, and something that's been largely private. Have you had any kind of pushback on that idea that you're presenting information that was largely unseen, and maybe some people prefer that it be that way?
Well, not so far. Keeping my fingers crossed about that. But, we're also on the Twitter feed and on the LinkedIn feed, we're also we're following and we're featuring community foundations and DAF sponsors all over the United States. And they're not just in the US. I mean, they're in the UK and they're in Canada and they're in Australia. And like, this is not just a US based thing either. And I think that people need to know that too, that this is an international phenomenon, the philanthropic transformation that's happening. And so, we're doing our best to sort of, I suppose, celebrate the sponsors that are helping donors make a difference. And so I think from that perspective, that's what they're in the business to do, right? These sponsors are in the business to make it easy for donors to set up funds and for people to be philanthropic. So, maybe it's Pollyanna-ish of me to say that they shouldnly be psyched about this kind of focus on them, but it's what they're in the business to do. So hopefully they're happy about us shining a spotlight on the philanthropy that they're helping enable.
Sure. Well, and I'm sure you found a big appetite in Apra world for this kind of information, if not far beyond that, because it was, again, so little understood. What kind of reaction are you getting from the world of research?
Prospect researchers are pretty psyched about it. I mean, it's again, it's kind of interesting because throughout my career, I've kind of I've been attracted to and wanted to highlight things that I think were sort of more difficult to find information about, right? So kind of early on in my career, I was interested in international research, tough to find information about. And, so I really wanted to make that kind of information available to people about resources that you could use to find information on international prospects. And then that kind of turned into, in around 2017, information about GDPR, because nobody over here, not nobody, but very few people over here were talking about GDPR and what the impact could be on international fundraising, particularly large organizations that had UK and EU based prospects. And so kind of got on board with that and talked about that over here just to make people aware of it. And so I sort of feel like Definitive and donor advised funds is kind of along that same sort of trajectory of my career, where I'm sort of recognizing something that people need to know a lot more about. People need to understand them. They need to understand about donor advised funds and giving and how people use their DAFs really differently in terms of the way that they think about their philanthropy and the timing of it. And so I just realized, I hope that I answered your question. I started going off on a... No,
you certainly did.
Yes,
and in fact, you
are interested. Yes.
You revealed a couple of things there that are really helpful in understanding also maybe how you might assess how well our associations are doing, because when you talked about an interest in international, that was as you said, early on in your career, and I know you've maintained that interest to today, but that was something obviously that we shared, and it was an area where there wasn't a lot of information. So providing some insight to that was and continues to be very important. That's certainly true with understanding donor advised funds, understanding what they're about, where there's information on it, what people can do in order to help people to give through those funds to our organization, so the money doesn't just sit there. That's been the controversial aspect. But in each of those cases, I know one of the potential impediments has been whether or not the service providers, and for that matter, our associations, have been a good bridge to the kind of information that was needed, the kinds of services that were needed, the training that was required. And it occurs to me that you've been involved all along the path with Apra and NEDRA, but also with RIF overseas and other associations. And there's a big discussion within those worlds right now about what services they provide, what they should be doing for their members, how they can continue to be strong and relevant and sustainable. And one of those is about Prospect L. I'm wondering if you'd be willing to say something about your thoughts on whether or not services like that, conversational pieces that allow everyone to share this kind of information we've been talking about, whether those should be public or behind paywalls.
Well, there's a lot to unpack here with Prospect L. And part of it, there's sort of 3 or 4 different things that are going on here. One is that Apra, NEDRA, all these organizations are run by volunteers, and the volunteers are reliant on the organizations that they utilize to help them run their association. And so the volunteers the volunteer board members may, one of the things that is incumbent upon the association management companies is to make sure that their clients remain solvent. And so when they are looking for opportunities to help their clients, their association clients, remain solvent, they might suggest putting something behind a paywall that's a very valuable tool in order to increase membership. Mm-hmm. And you can understand that. And from a volunteer board perspective, having somebody present to you something that could bring more revenue into your association sounds like a good thing. So I don't think that they can, either of those groups can be faulted for identifying a potential revenue source and wanting to. And I'm not saying that that's what's going on, because I really don't know what's happening behind the. But as a former Apra board member, I was myself in conversations like that back in the day about revenue generating things. And so I can imagine that is one of the conversations that they're having. So that's one thing. The next thing is that I happened to be on the board when Prospect L was moved from one format to another. It was run for years by Joe Boki just as a Yahoo group, or I think it was a Yahoo group. And then Joe couldn't maintain it anymore. And so it got moved to Charity Channel, which was a for-profit entity. And then Apra decided that they wanted to take that or have it be absorbed into Charity Channel, and absorbed from Charity Channel into Apra. And one of the promises that was made at that point, because Mark D. Philippus was running it at that point, one of the promises was that it would remain free for everyone forever if it was going to move to Apra. Mm-hmm. And at that point, the Apra board promised and said yes, that it would. Now, fast forward to today, the people who are running the association management as representative of the association management to the board is a completely different person. Like, they wouldn't have that historical knowledge of what happened then. It would be in the minutes of the past board meetings, but unless you knew to go back and look at those minutes, you wouldn't know that they existed. Mm-hmm. And of course, none of the current board members were there during that time to know what was happening at that time either, unless they knew to go to the past board members and say, hey, what do you know about what's going on with Prospect L? So that's another piece of the puzzle. But just generally, in terms of how I feel about Prospect L, it should be free to all comers, because part of what Prospect L does, besides educate our own community and help us form bonds of friendship and continued learning amongst our community, is that it also lets people know outside of the community, hey, there's this thing called prospect research, and it exists, and I could potentially be a prospect development professional one day. And the only way that I can learn about it right now, because I don't have the money to go to a conference or anything, is by subscribing to this listserv. And it will at least get me part of the way to understanding what I don't know about prospect research. So it's got a community education part of it as well. And so that's how I feel about what's going on with ProspectL. I think that it needs to be free to all comers. I understand that from a Apra perspective, it's a potential revenue generating thing, but I also think that it's going to turn people away from being members of Apra if that is no longer something that Apra supports. So that's how I feel about that.
I'm wondering if there's any kind of learning from the experience we're having with this, but also the things you've been talking about throughout our conversation about kind of standing up and speaking your mind, as you've just done, but all the way from deciding to go to Manchester and putting the note on the board that led you to the position in Boston, to being willing to be interviewed, and then perhaps surprisingly, but still willing to be pictured in the front of the Chronicle, founding your own company. Each of these are instances where you saw an opportunity to do something of value and you pursued it. And I wonder if there is some kind of learning in there for others in the field as they work with these associations, ways that they can contribute to make them vital and sustainable, but also relevant as we go forward and research and prospect development and fundraising, for that matter, change.
Yeah, well, I think that, it's important to show up. And, well, it's just like everything in life, right? I mean, voting, like, go vote. Mm-hmm. If you don't like something that's happening in your professional association, say something, show up. If you think that the knowledge is lacking in a particular area of your peers, or you just, find some cool tools, show up, go speak at a presentation, do a presentation for your chapter or for Apra. I mean, it's history. What is it? History is changed by those who show up. I mean, that's really it, right? We're only here for a short period of time, so we need to make the most of it.
The Philanthropy Masterminds podcast is underwritten by DonorSearch, the world leader in donor intelligence solutions. Our producer is Jack Frost. Our theme music is Be My Remedy, composed and performed by House of Say. You can subscribe to the Philanthropy Masterminds podcast on Apple Podcasts or wherever you get your podcasts. And you can find blogs, webcasts, and CFRE accredited webinars with our featured masterminds at DonorSearch.net, or check the show notes and descriptions.